Okay, so week 3, we're starting to get more into the controversy surrounding the theory of evolution. Thinking, again, we're going to sort of maintain this emphasis on the basics of what evolutionary theory is and how it's changed over time, and then how we can think about evolutionary theory in order to determine like what parts of the theory make sense and are well supported, and what parts of the theory maybe have some room to be improved or need to be thrown out for whatever reason. So here we go. I keep putting this up because I think it's really important whenever we're doing science or thinking about science to really focus on the question. And we tell our students this thing all the time, like, what is your question? What are you trying to understand? Evolutionary theory is all about answering these two questions. We observe life. We notice that there are lots of similarities among organisms, but there are also lots of differences. And how can we explain these two sort of contradictory points of view that we see every day? And last time we went over sort of the history of evolutionary theory, and the point of that exercise was to sort of get across this idea that evolutionary theory didn't sort of spring forth in Darwin's mind. It didn't spring forth, from the mouth of one individual. It was something that developed over a long period of time due to a lot of effort by a lot of different people. And so we started off looking at the early 1800s with this radical idea that maybe species could change over time and they don't always stay the same. We got Darwin and Mendel in the late 1850s coming up with sort of a framework for understanding how species might change, and then Mendel really going in and demonstrating that that these traits could be inherited across species. So we're starting to get evidence for these types of processes happening in the real world. It wasn't until the early 1900s where we really had the advent of population genetics that took some of these ideas and sort of focused them on the unit of evolution being the population, and then provided a mathematical and statistical framework for understanding the process. And shortly after that, we had the discovery that DNA was the molecule that allowed traits to be transmitted from generation to generation. And we really had this focusing of evolutionary theory that we now call the modern evolutionary synthesis. That really said we could take all of this evidence from Darwin and from Mendel and our understanding of some of the molecules involved, and we can put it within this mathematical framework provided by population genetics, and that would allow us to have sort of a rigorous evolutionary theory. And I'm going to put the structure of DNA here on this timeline because I think even though it happened after the technical modern synthesis, it really provided a mechanistic explanation for how traits work. And really it's the combination of population genetics and the ideas of the modern synthesis with molecular understanding of how life works that is really where we're at in terms of consensus on what evolutionary theory is now. That was a lot of words. So what came out of this idea? So key points of the modern evolutionary synthesis. First of all, the unit of evolution is a population, so we have to understand how populations work. This idea that evolution is a gradual process that happens over time. Natural selection as an important driver for changes that occur over time. And really the core idea is that there's small changes that we can observe. So we can go into a population, we can observe frequencies of alleles, and we can see how that population changes over time. We can directly observe it. And then if we extrapolate that type of process can lead to the big changes that we see between different species, like dogs and humans or lizards and chickens. So it's this idea that microevolutionary processes that we can directly observe, plus a lot of time, leads to macroevolutionary changes. So how can we sort of get into this and start understanding a little bit about what population genetics actually is and how it works kind of on the ground? I'm not going to put any equations up here, but I want to just sort of highlight some of the thinking or some of the concepts. So population genetics is all about considering how trait frequencies change across generations. And so I said population genetics focuses on the population, but first I'm going to focus on individuals. So if you're into genealogies, this will look familiar. These are two parents, two individual parents that mate to produce an offspring. So you can think about how humans mate, you can think about how animals mate. Plants do similar things most of the time, but we're sort of in this model of two parental individuals combining to form an offspring. And I've colored the parents here based on observable traits. So this could stand for any type of trait like height, hair color, eye color, anything you want. But they're just going to be blue and green. So mating balls, some are blue, some are green. And the question is, when these two parents mate, what trait is their offspring going to have? Is it going to be blue, is it going to be green, or is it going to be some combination of the two? And this idea really goes back to the work of Mendel, plus I'm adding a bit of molecular genetics, because now we understand the genetic basis of inheritance. Mendel didn't, but now we do. So I'm going to combine the two right now. So in most animals and some plants, organisms are diploid. So we each have two of each chromosome. So we have a pair of each chromosome. So I'm just showing this picture of DNA here and see how each parent has two of them. And I'm going to pretend that this trait, this blue trait, is controlled by one gene. And it can either be blue or it can be green. So this is the gene. There's one copy on each chromosome. And if you have two green copies, guess what? You're green. And if you have two blue copies, guess what? You're blue. So this is a single gene trait, but it can, the theory can scale up to multiple genes collectively controlling a trait. But we're just going to keep it simple. Now, because we understand how chromosomes work and how genes work and how DNA works, we can look at not only the phenotype of the individual, what color it is, but its genotype. And we know if one parent has two blue alleles and the other parent has two green alleles, and we know how mating works, you get one chromosome from your mom and one chromosome from your dad, then we know that this offspring has to have one blue allele and one green allele. So we know its genotype, but how does that translate into the phenotype? Depends on how what's called the genetic architecture works. Genetic architecture is just a word that means how the genotype translates into the phenotype. And there's different ways that it can work. And again, this goes back to a lot of Mendel's work working this out. So for example, if blue is dominant, then if you have one blue allele, you'll be blue. If green is dominant, you have one green allele, so you'll be green. The other allele is silent. If blue and green are additive, then you might have some blending or combination of the two. In this case here, like an aqua color. So the phenotype of the individual offspring depends on its genotype, the genotype of its parents, and how that genotype translates into the trait that we can see, or the phenotype. But we can describe, instead of describing the genotypes, we can describe just, instead of describing the phenotypes, we can instead just describe the genotypes. So in this case, I'm just encoding the genotype in the color. So this is half blue, half green. This is blue, blue, and this is green, green. Okay? Pretty simple. So that works if your parents are both what's called homozygotes. So one is blue, blue, and one is green, green. But what if they were heterozygotes as well? So for example, if you had two parents like this, one has a blue allele and a green allele, the other has a blue allele and a green allele. So what is the genotype of this offspring going to be? Well, if it gets a blue from this parent and a green from this parent, it'll be blue-green. Or the converse, it gets a blue from over here and a green from over here, it'll still be blue-green. But there's also other combinations, like it could get this blue and this blue. So it could be a homozygous blue, or it could be a homozygous green if it gets this green and this green, right? So all basic Mendelian genetics. So given that your two parents are half blue and half green, you could either be blue half blue and half green, or green, right? And so that's, the basics of single gene Mendelian inheritance. And again, the theory scales up to multiple alleles and quantitative traits. But we're not going to do that today. Not enough time. So population genetics puts this simple sort of Mendelian mating process in the context of a population. So now you can imagine this population of little circles, and I'm showing the genotype. So this is a population of 30 individuals. 5 of them are heterozygous, so they have a blue allele and a green allele. 10 of them, I believe, are blue-blue, and the remaining 15 are green-green. So this is a starting population, so you can imagine going out into a new environment and finding this population of multicolored circles and studying them. So what this population does, and what population genetics tries to understand, is how this population over time changes into a new population. Anyways, this is just the breakdown that we observe. So at the beginning, we observe 5 out of 30 that are heterozygous, 10 that are blue, and 15 that are green-green. Now these individuals get together and mate. So they produce offspring that's going to create the next generation. And so we can work out through this Mendelian process what their offspring would look like. So if these two individuals got together and mated, they could have a blue-blue, a green-green, or a blue-green, right? If these two individuals got together, it has to be blue. If these two individuals get together, it has to be green. If these two homozygotes come together, it has to be a heterozygote, blue-green, etc. So we can work out all of the different combinatorial possibilities, and we can come up with equations to describe how this works, if we want to. Yes?
Is this only based on phenotype, or are you also considering genotype?
So for this right here, I'm only considering genotype. But I'm sort of assuming that the genotype to phenotype is pretty straightforward. In some cases, it's not. In some cases, the way that the genes organize themselves to create a phenotype can be very complex and difficult to understand. Luckily for Mendel, he chose very simple traits when he started his study, so he was able to work them out kind of by hand. But we can work all of that out using computers and simulations and large amounts of data crunching that we can do today. So somehow these individuals will organize themselves and start mating to produce offspring. And then the question for population genetics is, given this starting population and some amount of time, what are the frequencies of blue-green, blue, and green individuals going to be in the future? And obviously this depends on a lot of things. For one thing, it depends on how they pair up to mate, right? And so one of the things we do in population genetics is we assume that mating is random. And that becomes a null hypothesis that we can then see if is it true or not. Does this population behave as if it were mating randomly, or is there some sort of structure for the way individuals pair up? Like, do good-looking individuals tend to pair up together, not so good-looking individuals pair up together, or whatever? Individuals that are close by might pair up. There's lots of different mating structures, but we can formulate hypotheses about how that works. Another thing that can affect these frequencies in the future is whether this population is expanding or contracting. So you can think if resources are limited, then the number of offspring might get fewer and fewer. The population might get smaller and smaller over time. Whereas if there's lots of resources and lots of space, the population may get bigger and bigger over time. Or it might stay the same. And so how the population dynamics are playing out over time can affect what these frequencies are later on. Finally, there are things like mutations. So some individuals, even though this green individual and this green individual should only produce green offspring, maybe there's a mutation, a random event that happens that changes one of the alleles in the offspring to make it different. So what the mutation rate is and what types of mutations tend to happen can change allele frequencies over time. And finally, we have natural selection. So if some individuals are less fit, less able to survive and reproduce than others, they're not going to make it to the next generation as easily, and so their population frequencies are going to go down. So all of these things affect the way we understand how allele frequencies change from one generation to the next. And so if we build mathematical and computational models to incorporate all of these different types of events, we can then create a way to predict, based on all of these different forces that are acting on the population, how its allele frequencies are going to change over time. Does that kind of make sense? That's essentially what population genetics attempts to do. And it's obviously a work in progress. We're constantly trying to come up with better and better models to understand how populations evolve. But it's all fit within this conceptual framework that there's variation in traits, there's heredity or genetics that allow traits to be transmitted across generations, and there's some sort of differential reproduction. Not everyone gets to reproduce as much as they would like or as much as possible. And so that's sort of where we are now, the idea that this type of description about how populations work is sufficient to describe everything that we observe. Now, it's not entirely true. There have been some calls, really since the 1950s, but really recently there's been maybe a slightly louder voice saying that we need to incorporate some other ideas into what's being called an extended evolutionary synthesis. That the modern synthesis isn't quite enough to explain everything. We need to incorporate some new ideas. Things like epigenetics, this idea that is evolution really a gradual, stepwise process, or are there sort of jumps, are there leaps, are there times when things move faster or slower? And then finally, this idea that the developmental process, that how an animal goes from an embryo to an adult, it may be contributing to the way that evolution works. And so I'll just briefly mention some of these ideas that scientists are thinking about adding to evolutionary theory. They're not yet a consensus, but they're on the horizon. And a big one is epigenetics. So last time I kind of talked about how I could go to the gym and get really, really strong, but no matter how strong I got, that trait that I acquired during my lifetime could never be passed on to my children because it wasn't genetic. So there's an idea that there are epigenetic things or traits that I could acquire during my lifetime which I could then pass on to my offspring. Very Lamarckian, not really a Darwinian idea. And so one of the epigenetic things that we do have evidence for is changes in DNA methylation. So DNA can have these chemical markers placed on it in certain places. And those chemical markers can change when and how certain genes are turned on and off. And it turns out that when and how genes are turned on and off can often be just as important for evolutionary processes as what genes you have. So when you activate a gene may be important for your phenotype. And so there's some evidence that epigenetic marks, these chemicals on DNA that control gene regulation, can be inherited from generation to generation, also acquired as you live. So there's an idea that epigenetics may provide a mechanism through which you can acquire a trait during your lifetime and then pass it on to your offspring. Another thing that's been brought up recently is that we know that organisms can change their environment, right? We know that there would be much less atmospheric oxygen without plants. So once plants came along, they changed the atmosphere, and that allowed certain things to happen. We know, for example, that we can radically alter our environment. The entire environment that we can see around us has been created by ourselves. And so there's this idea that does the capacity of organisms to alter their environment change the way natural selection might work? And when you think about human evolution, have we gotten to the point where we can change our environment so radically that we've essentially extracted ourselves from a natural selection process? And we're sort of in this realm of human-generated evolution. Again, something that scientists are thinking about, but there's not really consensus yet. And finally, a lot of scientists and researchers are thinking about this idea, how constrained are evolutionary processes? Can evolution basically do anything? Or are there certain things that evolution can't really accomplish? Some of the things that people are thinking about is history. So does what happened in the past change the way evolution might work in the future? Does how the genotype translates into the phenotype, or does the genetic architecture of a certain trait place any constraints on how that trait can later evolve? And finally, this evolution of development, that organisms, at least like complex animals, don't just spring forth as adults. They have to go through this process where they develop from embryos to reproducing adults. And does that process put any constraints on the way evolution can work? And again, we don't really know all the answers to all of these questions, but there's evidence accruing that some of these processes may impact how evolution works. And we're trying to understand if that's the case and to what extent it is. And so the point of all this is that the way we understand evolution changes as we learn more about it, right? So we go out into the world and we learn something, and then that changes what we know. Obvious, right? But given that, there is overwhelming support over hundreds of years of study that evolution is real. And this is not really a contentious issue amongst most sort of educated people. So again, to sort of focus in on the controversy isn't so much that is evolution real, are things evolving, is natural selection real, but is natural selection and evolution sufficient to explain everything that we observe, right? So I'm going to think a little bit about that question or that controversy. Is evolution sufficient to explain everything? So how are we going to kind of think about this problem? Again, back to our question, similarities and differences, and how do we explain both the similarities and the differences? So always have that question in mind as we move forward. So I'm going to introduce, if you haven't seen this, a technique for making decisions. It goes back to medieval times called Occam's razor. It's at least that old. And it's just this simple idea that the simplest explanation for the observable facts is the preferable one. So if you have two competing theories, one's very simple, one's very complex and difficult to understand, then we should believe the simpler one, as long as it explains everything that we see. Okay? So how can we think about evolution being sufficient or not with this idea of Occam's razor? Now, we know that there are a lot of observable facts that evolution can explain. We know about populations and how they evolve. We've seen examples of how the anoles evolved. We'll see some other examples later on. So there are a lot of facts that evolution can explain. The second thing that I'm going to raise, and I think it's an important one, is we don't know of any facts that have been demonstrated unexplainable by evolutionary theory. And I'm going to think about that just a little bit, because there's two ways of thinking about that. One way is to pick something up and go, I have no idea how evolution could explain that, so it doesn't. Right? That's what I call an argument from ignorance. And I use my example of a refrigerator. I have no idea how a refrigerator works. I really don't. So an argument from ignorance would say, I don't know how a refrigerator works, therefore it can't be explained. Right? And we're going to poo-poo this idea a little bit because it doesn't make sense. It's sort of this idea that I could never learn anything. Okay? So argument from ignorance is not my friend, and it shouldn't be your friend either. That's different from demonstrating that something cannot be explained. So if you can show through some rational argument or logic or bring evidence to bear that says, look, there's no way that this theory can explain this fact, that's a demonstration that this is unexplainable. It's not an argument from ignorance that I can't figure out how it explains that. But you have to somehow demonstrate that the theory cannot explain that. And there are some examples of this. The ones I'm aware of are from theoretical math, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, so it's probably not so helpful for you. But you can demonstrate that a theory is insufficient to explain something. But given that we don't have any standing facts that cannot be explained through evolution, we should accept it until we get any. It's a simple explanation. The basic concepts are easy to understand. It explains a lot of what we see, and we don't know of anything that it can explain. So let's accept it as a working hypothesis for now, and we can go out into the world and see, does it explain new observations or not? So we can test it, and that's basically what we do as scientists. But let's go back to this history of evolution. I just said evolutionary theory changes over time. So when we're asking, is evolutionary theory sufficient to explain everything, what evolutionary theory are we thinking about? Are we thinking about the modern synthesis? Are we thinking about Darwin's book? Are we thinking about population genetics? Or are we thinking about this extended evolutionary synthesis? So for the purpose of this course, I'm going to focus on sort of what I think is the core of evolutionary theory. And that is this idea of descent with modification. And that's what I'm going to sort of hold up as, if you don't have that, you don't have a theory of evolution. You have to have some sort of reproduction and differential reproduction, and you have to have some sort of variation or mutation, and you have to have heritability to pass things from generation to generation. And so, does this core evolutionary theory, is it sufficient to explain what we see? So I'm going to now open the floor to some people who don't agree with evolution and say, so what, when we look out into the world, what do we think evolution might not explain? And just to give you some context, I'm going to put some of the criticisms of evolution that arose before there was a theory of evolution, back in the 1800s, that species are immutable, they cannot change, they're too tightly integrated to allow them to change. There's no evidence that they could possibly change. And when you look at them, they look like a watch. They look like something that's designed. And remember that these were criticisms of evolution that were there before there was a theory of evolution. And now I'm going to let Stephen Meyer, the director of the Discovery Institute, raise his criticisms of modern evolutionary theory. This is a little bit of an old video, but it's the best one that I could find, so I hope it's enjoyable.
Tonight we look at the issue of intelligent design with Dr. Stephen Meyer, Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He and his colleagues have been at the center of this growing debate about the teaching of evolution in American schools. He is the co-author of 2 books, including Darwinism, Design, and Public Education. He joins us tonight from Seattle. Dr. Meyer, nice to have you on the program, sir.
Great to be with you, Tavis.
Let me start with those 2 questions that I posed in the introduction, namely and simply, what is intelligent design and why is it so controversial?
Oh, those are great questions. Well, as to what it is, it's the theory or the idea that there are certain features of biological systems that are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected process like Darwin's idea of natural selection. What features are we talking about? We're talking about things like the little miniature motors, the rotary engines, the turbines, the sliding clamps, this exquisite nanotechnology that scientists have been discovering in cells over the last 30 years. And we're also talking about something that's really interesting to me personally, which is the digital code that is inscribed along the spine of the DNA molecule, the instructions that the cell has for building all of these little miniature machines inside the cell. So we've got code and we've got machines in cells, and this looks to many scientists to be the evidence of an actual intelligent design, not an undirected process.
So for my mother who's watching in Indiana who doesn't have the degrees that you have, or for that matter that I have, what you're really saying is that the human organism, that the human body is so intricate that there has to be something other than this mere process of evolution that makes us who and what we are?
Right. I mean, we're not opposed to the idea of evolution per se, meaning change over time, but we are challenging the Darwinian idea that things arose through a purely undirected process. We think that things arose by some kind of design, and you can see the evidence of that when you look closely at the cell, because you've got, as I said again, this information encoded in DNA. We know from experience that when you get if you need a computer program, you need a computer programmer. In fact, we know that any time we find information, whether it's in the form of a hieroglyphic inscription or a newspaper headline, invariably there was an intelligent agent behind that information. So when we find information encoded in the DNA in this 4-character digital code that's responsible for all the instructions in the cell, it's the logical inference and explanation to say that an intelligent agent of some kind played a role in the origin of those living systems.
Let me ask a question after this preface. I don't
know if that helped your mother or not. Maybe there was still too many big words.
I'm going to ask another question I think might advance the conversation for her and others who are watching.
Yeah.
Let me put it this way then. What you call intelligent design, my mother and others might call God. So let me ask 2 questions. One, if it is God we're talking about here, why don't we call it what it is, number 1? And number 2, if that's not what you're saying, what then is the distinction, the difference between intelligent design and, shall I say, creationism?
Well, those are great questions. The key to this is the difference between the evidence and the implications. Okay. We're scientists, and we're looking at the evidence. And what we can tell from the evidence is that some kind of intelligence must have played a role. If you see an inscription, you see some written text, if you see software, you know that there was a programmer or an intelligence behind it. And that's what we got in the cell.
Okay.
Now, the question as to the identity of that intelligence, that's a second question, a second-order question. And for people who have a religious belief, this very well may support that religious belief. It's certainly, God is certainly a likely candidate to be the intelligent designer. We just, as scientists, can't prove that from the science. We can see that some intelligence played a role. And for people who are religious believers, it's a natural thing to associate their belief in God with the evidence they see of design in life. But we're just trying to be accurate and careful about the science and say what we can tell from the science and what we can't.
Fair enough. So President Bush steps into this debate some days ago and suggests that he thinks intelligent design ought to be taught in schools. Pick up the debate there and tell me what you thought of that controversy that erupted when he had to say what he said.
Well, it kind of interrupted my vacation plans for August. I've been doing a fair number of these shows with your colleagues.
But I'm glad to have you on.
Yeah, it's. I mean, certainly one of the things we appreciated about the President's statement was that it was a clear statement of principle in favor of academic freedom. And what we're finding around the country is that many scientists who are challenging the strict Darwinian interpretation of life, and scientists that are going further and even saying, hey, I think there is evidence of design, are paying a price for that in their scientific careers. And we've been somewhat reluctant to say, hey, we want our theory required in the public schools because we've got scientists who have paid a price in the laboratory, in the universities, when they have spoken up. And at this point, I think we just want to get everyone calmed down and have a rational discussion about this before we try to push it into the schools. But we appreciated the President's support for the idea that it's a perfectly legitimate thing for students to learn both sides or many sides of any controversial idea.
All right, to this scientific notion then that you've put forth of intelligent design, and I like your analogy earlier that if you see software, you know there had to be a programmer, whatever his name is, whatever you want to call him, there had to be a programmer that put this software in place. If that in fact is your argument, and I accept that, I understand it, tell me what the argument is essentially that the critics make against intelligent design being taught. Hate to put you in this spot of telling me what your critics say,
sure.
but as you interpret their argument, what are you hearing most fundamentally about why your critics don't want intelligent design taught in schools?
Well, one of the things, maybe the most common thing that we hear is that it's not a scientific explanation to say that intelligence played a role. But there are many sciences that do, in fact, infer intelligence. If you're an archaeologist and you find an inscription in a piece of rock, if you're looking at the Rosetta Stone, for example, you're going to infer that an intelligence played a role. And it turns out that there are developments in some technical fields, complexity and information sciences, that actually enable us to distinguish the results from an intelligent cause distinguish the results of intelligence as a cause from natural processes. And when we run those kinds of modes of analysis on the information in DNA, they kick out the answer, yeah, this was intelligently designed. So there is actually now a science of design detection. And when you analyze life through the filters of that science, it implies, it shows that life was intelligently designed. So one of the things we want to say to our critics is, look, we got to be open to whatever the answer is. We can't decide in advance that we're not going to allow certain kind of answers to be considered by scientists. The fundamental commitment that every scientist has is to follow the evidence where it leads, even if that leads to an uncomfortable conclusion, one that, you know, maybe your mother would like.
Let me ask you then where you think this debate is headed. Increasingly, I saw the New York Times op-ed page yesterday that was pretty much devoted almost exclusively to this issue. This conversation continues to take place around the country. Where is this conversation, this debate headed as you see, where science and faith, science and God, science and religion are concerned? Where is this intersection? Where are we headed with this intersection? Are we headed for some catastrophic crash here?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a lot of good science that's going to be done on the basis of the idea that life really was designed. I mean, the Darwinian idea is that things look designed, but they're not really designed because an undirected process called natural selection produced that illusion of design. And we've seen for 30, 40, 50 years now in biology that people actually approach the living cell as if it were an intricately designed system and then they actually do reverse engineering in order to figure out how the cell works. So we think that there's going to be a lot of good science that's going to be done on the basis of the conclusion that life was designed. And so that's one thing that our institute is particularly focused on. As far as these larger questions, I mean, people are kind of free to draw their own conclusions, but I think increasingly people are reluctant to say, as they were at the close of the 19th century, that there's a conflict between science and religious belief. I think increasingly people see that the two can go hand in harmony, and in fact that there's some evidence that actually supports a larger theistic perspective without necessarily being a proof of God's existence or something like that.
Let me ask you then a two-part exit question that might be a bit unfair, but forgive me in advance for asking it because I'm curious here. Tell me,
well, you got to ask the hard questions. That's your job.
Yeah,
right?
well, that is my job. Let me ask you then a two-part exit question. Part one, what is, and I think you may have already answered it, but I just wanted to get back on record here again and make sure I'm clear about it. What do you think is the strongest argument that you all can make at this moment for intelligent design, and where do you think that you're a little shaky? Where does more work have to be done for you all to get the majority of Americans or a significant number of Americans to accept the fact that intelligent design ought to be taught in schools? Where are you strong and where are you weak? Where are you shaky?
Thanks. You know, maybe I should clarify first just that we're not asking for our theory to be required in the schools.
Fair
I think
enough.
if a teacher wants to talk about it voluntarily, they should, but we don't want teachers to experience the kind of recriminations that some of our scientists have experienced.
Right.
I mean, we don't want teachers getting lynched over bringing an idea into the classroom, but we of course think they ought to be free to do that.
Sure.
But on the science, I think this argument from information is extremely strong. I think people get it right away. I think more and more scientists are getting intrigued with the idea that we've got an information processing system and digital code in the cell. We've got to explain that. We haven't done that from an evolutionary standpoint, and yet it screams intelligence. We've also got a lot of little miniature machines that also look for all the world like something that was designed by very, very intelligent engineers. So I think those are very strong arguments for design. I think one of the things that we want to do to advance our research program further is start to draw out the implications of intelligent design for different aspects of biology, and that's going to take more research dollars, more scientists devoting their career to that. And we see we're in the early stages of that, and we think there will be more research coming that shows how fruitful intelligent design is for making other discoveries in science.
Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, Director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. Dr. Meyer, I enjoyed our conversation.
All right, thanks for watching. You know, like I said, that's pretty much from the scientific arm of the intelligent design community. That's a lot of what people who criticize or are critical of evolution are thinking about. I just wanted to sort of let him explain in his own words and then sort of recap some of the points that I got out of that interview. Again, so this is a popular interview. It wasn't a scientific forum, so it's not technical. But this idea that there's something digital, some sort of information in the DNA code that seems like it's intelligent, it was designed, it was organized by some sort of intelligence. This idea that there are these complex molecular machines, you hear that term a lot. Scientists like me use the term molecular machines a lot. I don't think we necessarily should. I'm not sure there's evidence that molecules really behave machine-like. It's an analogy that doesn't necessarily hold up, but we'll get into some of that later. But the main thing, the core idea, I think, that people who are critical of evolution are really thinking about is they look at things that are very complicated, very tightly integrated, and they say, how can a random process take these simple things that are around and put them together into something that's really complicated and really intricate? It doesn't make sense intuitively. It doesn't seem like that would happen. So it does seem to smack of an argument from ignorance, but I'm just gonna leave it at that, and we're gonna get more into this next week in our last session. But I wanted to sort of get at this idea of how do complex things arise from simpler things, and sort of get that into your mind. And then I'll show this final video of an example looking at how evolution of something very complex could arise. And this happens to be flight. How very complex trait involves lots of different structures all organized together to work. So how could something like that just spontaneously arise through this undirected evolutionary process? And this will be...
The evolution of flight in birds has long been a great scientific puzzle. Fossil evidence from the past 40 years has established that birds descended from theropods, a lineage of two-legged dinosaurs that included species with feathers on their bodies and arms. But those early animals could not fly. So how did birds take flight? A new hypothesis came from my studies of young birds that are learning to fly. And it all started with a bale of hay. I've been studying the mechanics of bird flight for over 3 decades at the University of Montana's Flight Lab. I became interested in an intriguing question that critics of evolutionary theory had posed to Darwin.
So there's a gentleman by the name of Sir George Jackson Mivart. He challenged Charles Darwin when Charles wrote The Origin of Species.
Darwin had proposed that structures evolve through intermediates. So a wing would have evolved from forelimb in stages. But some of those early stages were clearly not capable of flight. Mivart confronted Darwin.
He said to Darwin, how do you explain in the evolution of birds from reptiles the function of half a wing?
So to answer that question, I looked to a living example. Bird chicks with small, immature wings. I wanted to make careful observations of how chicks use their wings as they learn to fly.
I was keeping the birds on these shiny floor, clean lab conditions, and trying to have them go up a wall that was slick to fly up to their siblings. As soon as a rancher came in once and said, "What are these birds doing on the ground? They hate being on the ground. Give them a bale of hay, give them something to get up on."
As soon as I got some hay bales for the chicks, we made an interesting observation.
I came back one day, and my son, who had been helping me, I asked him, "How are they doing? How was the data today?" And he says, "It was horrible." I say, "Why?" He says, "They were cheating. And that moment, a watershed moment in my life, what do you mean they were cheating? They ran straight up vertically. I said, that's impossible.
To better understand this behavior, my son Terry and I decided to carefully measure how young birds use their legs and wings together to travel up ramps of different angles.
So here's our little experimental animal here. And
My friend Julia Clark, an expert on the evolutionary origin of birds, joined us on our experiments. The first angle is not steep.
It's wild.
Right.
This is not a
trained animal.
This is not a trained animal.
That was easy.
Just walked, no problem, nonchalant,
Yep.
no wing necessary.
Next, we try a sharper angle.
Okay, so this is much steeper than before.
It is.
Let's see what happens.
There we go.
You're not sure what you see because
Exactly.
it's so fast.
And until you see it in slow motion, you don't know how beautiful it actually is.
This time, the bird used its wings as it ran.
And every time it felt like it was falling backwards, it used its wings not to pull it up. And this is what we discovered. It wasn't to lift it up and take it like a bird flying straight up to this, this refuge. It was using its wings to pull it forward onto this log.
And now, a really steep ascent.
That is going to be a challenge, right?
So this is now nearly vertical.
This is vertical, standing tall, vertical like any tree.
Right.
Let's see what the animal can do to
All right.
negotiate this. It can fly, but
But it's still using its legs. Still using its legs.
it climbed with its legs, using its wings to pull it towards the tree, but not to fly it up this.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. This has turned out to be not just representative of the bird we looked at, but every flight-capable bird that we've looked at in the 15 years since. Dozens and dozens of birds.
I have also observed the same behavior in the wild. And I have even seen young birds use their wings to assist their hind limbs to paddle across a body of water.
So Ken, how did this change the way we think about how dinosaurs get in the air?
Well, we now know that there are a lot of dinosaurs, little feathered theropods that have little wings. And the explanation for their existence is really difficult to resolve. And I think that a reasonable explanation is to look at what young birds with similar wings can do today. Birds show us the possibility of what these dinosaurs could have done.
Scientists have long debated two main possibilities for how flight evolved. Dinosaurs could have used their clawed hands to climb up trees and then glide down, with this gliding behavior eventually evolving into flight. Or dinosaurs could have run faster and faster on the ground, flapping their wings, and some species then evolved the ability to fly. But our research suggests a third possibility.
So every bird that we've looked at, dozens of different species, do this behavior. They exhibit this behavior of flap and running. No gliding. They don't jump off of a bale of hay and glide down, and they don't fly up. They flap, run up, and they flap down.
Juvenile theropods might have used their forelimbs similarly. In the adults, the legs alone were probably sufficient to escape predators or to hunt down prey. But in growing theropods, small wings provided an advantage.
Just imagine the selective pressure at the time of theropod dinosaurs. Everything's trying to eat everybody, chasing everybody. If you could have moved up to an elevated refuge with the use of these little wings, you would have lived to see tomorrow.
Those young theropods would have run up to escape predators and then flapped back down when it was safe. Over time, small wings evolved into larger ones, until these feathered dinosaurs were able to take to the air.
All right, thanks for watching and thanks for coming this week. So I think the take-home message that I want to leave you with today is that it's not enough to just say, well, I can't figure out how this possibly could have happened, so we have to jettison the entire approach and come up with something new. We have to sort of carefully look at the evidence and carefully look at nature and try to figure out what's going on. And sometimes we don't get the answer that we think we're going to get. And that's fine. We just have to sort of keep looking and keep trying to understand how things happen. And another sort of theme that we'll get at, again, next week, which I think was illustrated in this last video, is that the function of a structure can change as it evolves. So the function of a wing can do one thing when the wing is small and immature, and a different thing when the wing is bigger and coordinated with other types of structures in the adult animal. And so the idea of function is not a static thing in evolution. It changes as well as other things. Anybody have any final questions for today? All right, thanks again for coming. We'll see you next week.